whether Jesus claimed to be God, a claim that's been made frequently on his behalf since he arose into heaven. But did he actually claim to be God himself while he was here? This presentation is a series running under the theme, The Nature of God. It's a Gospel Online 23-24 project. If you find the subject matter helpful, don't forget to subscribe to it and hit the bell-shaped button if you want to be notified of the next series of lectures which are going to be released over the next few weeks. If you've got comments or questions, please just let us know. So, first question then, how does Jesus get presented in the Bible? What titles is he assigned? The good news is that the Bible is very clear and consistent when it comes to describing one of its most important characters. Over 40 times, Jesus is referred to as the Son of God. It was what the angel had promised Mary she would receive when she gave birth. It was why Gospels like the Gospel of John was written. The Gospel was written so that people would believe that this was the Son of God. Equally, as well as that title, Son of God, Jesus himself uses the title Son of Man over 80 times, and he uses it as he's talking to people, as he's teaching his disciples. And it's a title which is taken from a prophecy in Daniel, the Old Testament. In contrast, if we consider some of the titles that have been used to describe Jesus outside the Bible, well, nowhere in the Bible will you find Jesus being described or claiming the title God the Son. Nowhere will you explicitly find him saying, I am God. And you might be surprised to know that the word Trinity doesn't actually come in the Bible at all. So what did Jesus say on the subject himself then? Well, intriguingly, Jesus claims a whole host of different titles. I counted over 20 of them. Here's a selection for you, and you can see I've put the New Testament references there if you want to take a look at how he claims titles such as these. And he claimed more than these himself. I only had limited space on the screen. It transpires that he did this with good reason, because in the Old Testament, there are literally hundreds of prophecies concerning the tasks that Jesus would have to fulfill when he arrived. And people were desperate for the role to be filled. So each one of these titles then that Jesus claims has origin in the Old Testament. I've put those there for you to have a look at those as well if you wish to. This was a job that needed doing. It was a promise of God that needed keeping. So every time Jesus has opportunity, he makes a connection with the Old Testament prophecies to underline for people who he was and what he was doing. And perhaps because public interest was so acute, the people that Jesus deals with appear to pick up on his messaging. So there's a whole host of different groups that Jesus was dealing with. Groups of disciples, individual disciples, friends, co-workers, Romans, Jews, the Jewish elite. All of them, you can see, seem to use very similar language. None of them say that you are God. They all either say something like you are the Son of the living God, or they attribute him with the title that the Christ. And perhaps that title, the Christ, is just worth us considering for a few moments. It's a word that we hear perhaps daily as an expletive now, but it's never used like that in the Bible. The word Christ actually appears over 500 times in the New Testament, but never in the Old Testament, which shouldn't be a surprise because it's a Greek word, Christos, which has been transliterated across. And what's happening when that word is used is it's referring back to an Old Testament idea, that the word that we quite often use regarding what God had promised that his son would do is the word Messiah. Actually, that word is only translated into the English Messiah a couple of times. Much more often it's translated anointed, which was fitting because priests were anointed into the service of God. Kings were anointed too, but potentially prophets as well. It was a sign that this individual was was acting with God's authority. And when you review the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, there are over 300 of them, which point to different roles and different tasks that the Messiah, Christ, was going to fulfill when he arrived. And so close was the relationship between God and his son, Messiah, going to be, that he's actually assigned some of his father's names in certain passages. So here's one, a well-known passage for the time of year when people are thinking about the birth of the Messiah. To us a child is born, to us a son is given. So notice clearly that this is a child who was expected. God's son is going to be dispatched. And then the prophecy opens up to give us a picture for some of the roles that he would do. Government will be on his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. Now that's an interesting title. And the word El there is often used to describe God. It is one of the names which he is given in the Old Testament. But it can also be used to or translated as great, mighty one, power, strong. The same word is actually used in the prophecy of Ezekiel to describe Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Egypt. And an alternative translation for mighty God could be mighty warrior. The mighty warrior, the Messiah, was eventually going to fight the people's battles for them. He would lead them into battle. And we can treat the next phrase in a similar manner. So, everlasting Father, the word Father there is often used of God, but it's not limited to him. So the word is also translated ancestor, author, origin, governor, protector. And the word it's linked to, everlasting, has the idea of looking to the future. These are things that we might understand the Messiah will be doing in the future. And notice his name shall be called. So whereas the Messiah that the world has seen so far has fulfilled all sorts of prophecies regarding releasing people from sin and giving them hope for the future, we have yet to see the Son of God fulfilling a military role or ruling, as some of these prophecies foretell. So let's just take stock for a moment then. We've established that whilst some of the Messianic prophecies predict that Messiah would have a very close relationship with God, even to the point where you might share some of God's names as he performs God's will, well, even so, when the Messiah arrived, while he claimed to be many things that had been promised, he never once explicitly claimed that he was God. Son of God, yes. On multiple occasions, people identified him as such, and he acknowledged it, but not God himself. In which case, you might ask, well, why do some say that he did do such a thing? This is where we have to get a bit more technical. For amongst the 20 or so titles which Jesus claimed while he was performing his ministry, some have identified a pattern, and specifically they identify it playing out in the Gospel of John. So 7 times in the Gospel of John, when Jesus claims titles of the Messiah, which had been prophesied before he arrived, he uses the word I am. On another occasion, Jesus says, before Abram was, I am. And when the Jewish leaders challenged him as to who he was, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Jesus is reported to have said, I am. And some suggest that rather than this being an explicit claim made by Jesus to be God, it is an implicit claim. And they do that on the basis of passages such as Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses asked God who he would like to be introduced to the children of Israel as. So, what will your name be? He says to God. And you see there on the screen, God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, the link then is made that God's name "I am" is a phrase which Jesus uses repeatedly to describe himself as he links to the identity, the tasks of the Messiah. I would have to advise some caution here, because this name that that God adopts is not an easy one to translate into the English. I've got various options in my margin. I am because I am that I am who I am. And the consensus now is that that final suggestion is the accurate, the correct one. I will be that I will be, or I will be who I will be. This has a future element. God was telling Moses that he was utterly in control, past, future, and present. And adopting a name meaning I will be who I will be actually makes a lot of sense, particularly when you realize that God was about to fulfill a whole host of promises that he'd made to Abram. He was going to save Israel from Egypt. He was going to give them a home. He was going to guarantee them a future. That these were all promises that could only be made by God, by a God who understood the future. That there would be no surprises here that might prevent him delivering what he promised. And so his memorial name, as it's called, was a name that was designed to help Israel remember that God was the ultimate in reliability. He would be who he would be, that there would be no change of direction. What he promised was ultimately deliverable by a God such as this. Of course, that omniscience, that ability to know everything, was not something that Jesus could claim. Jesus actually says of his return, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. In contrast, we're told on various occasions in different places that God knows everything, that there is nothing hidden from him. I think it's also worth noting when we're thinking of these I am passages, specifically in the Gospel of John, that whilst people suggest it might be Jesus invoking his Father's name and thereby implying that he's God himself, the words that Jesus actually uses there are just the present tense of to be. They're not Hebrew, but they're Greek. And Jesus isn't unique in using them either. You can see on the screen that centurions, family members, people that Jesus healed, apostles, they all used exactly the same phrase. And clearly, they're not claiming to be God by using that collection of words. If you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that whilst Jesus displayed many of the characteristics of his Father, there also had to be some essential differences that were going to be necessary in order for Jesus to perform his role. So we're told that God is not man, that he should lie, and yet the Messiah, in delivering his Father's promises, would need to experience very human ailments and challenges. So Jesus was going to have to be tempted like we are. God can't be. Jesus, the Messiah, was going to have to die. God cannot. He's eternal. That the Messiah was going to be with the people and to be seen by the people. God simply cannot do that. Because just because Jesus may not have been God does not mean that they weren't incredibly close in their relationship. And there are passages where Jesus specifically underlines how close he was to his Father. Here's one, John chapter 10. I and my Father are one. So he leaves no doubt at all as to how close the relationship with his Father was. But is that one in person, or is that one in plan and one in purpose? Well, intriguingly, that unity that Jesus describes here is one that he also desired between his followers. And also just as he and his Father were united in purpose. So he wanted his followers to be united with them in purpose. It's true also that the Jewish leaders, although they might have misunderstood the characteristics that Jesus was describing, that they didn't accuse him of claiming to be divine. They didn't understand that he was claiming to be God. What they objected to was that he was claiming to be equal with God. And he was doing that, well, by claiming that God was his father. See, therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his father, making himself equal with God. Now, if Jesus was God, you might imagine that at such an important moment in this as when the Jewish leaders are looking for reasons to deal with him, to accuse him falsely, that Jesus would have taken the opportunity to correct them. You might imagine that if Jesus was God, he would have taken this moment to say, no, I'm not the Son of God, I am God. But he doesn't do that. In fact, he does the opposite. Jesus actually takes this opportunity to reinforce the idea that he was the Son of God and that of himself he could do nothing, that his power, which he was exercising in miracles and in teaching, was from God, rather than being, in the equation because God was there too in person. That Jesus was equally, he shared the plan, he shared the purpose, but he wasn't the same person. And you can see John 14 and John 5, Jesus said this on various different occasions. He consistently acknowledges the source of his power. There's another well-known passage where Jesus says, "He that has seen me has seen the Father." But viewed in the context of everything else Jesus was saying, it becomes clear that what Jesus was describing here was, that he was equal in terms of character and purpose. But both the New Testament and the Old Testament tell us that no one can see God and live. No one could hear his voice and survive. And yet, so close was Jesus to his Father's character that he provided the opportunity for people to see God in action, if you will. Jesus, the things he was saying, the things he was doing, were things that God would approve of, that they were things that God would do himself, if indeed the people could have stood to be seen by him or heard of him. So in summary then, when we take account of all that Jesus said and what was foretold of the Messiah, the role that he was going to fulfill, we can see clearly that Jesus never explicitly claimed to be God. Rather, he repeatedly claimed to be the Son of God and the Son of Man. His purpose was one and the same with his Father. He was sent to fulfill a host of different promises that his Father had made. And the people around him understood who he was. Christ, the Son of the living God, is how they described him when challenged or when the opportunity arose. Even his enemies didn't understand him to be claiming divine status. They were just incensed that he claimed to be the Son of God, a claim that modern Jews still today reject. They don't believe the Messiah will be God's Son. They will believe he will be a great leader, but that he will be mortal, the son of a man and a woman. And what we find then is ultimately God, who cannot be seen, who knows all things, who is eternal and therefore cannot die, asked his Son to die in order to save the world. And this was a Son who developed such a close bond with his Father that he could confidently claim that all he did and all that he said were according to his Father's will. So I hope you found this video useful. Perhaps it's raised some questions or presented a perspective that you haven't heard before. So feel free to comment or ask questions if there are issues that you don't think we've addressed. Remember that this presentation is one of a series running under the theme, The Gospel Online. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button or even the bell-shaped notification if you want to be reminded as the series is released over the next few weeks. Thanks for listening.